Ever feel like the digital world is dragging you under? In this episode, I sit down with Craig Mattson, author, professor, and deep thinker on digital culture, to unpack the hidden emotional currents of digital overwhelm. If you're a content creator or just someone swimming in tech and tired of drowning in it, this conversation is the lifeboat you've been waiting for. Yeah, and I feel as content creator, I don't know if that's because I'm going to say what I understand digital overwhelm to mean, so that to guide the conversation we'll have for the many 50 to 55 minutes. I think digital overwhelm is when you have so many stuff coming at you from the digital that at the end of the day, you just end up being crippled or paralyzed, not doing anything.
Yes, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good definition.
Yeah.
In my book that I just published, I offer a metaphor. May I share that with you?
Please do.
Okay, so if you can think about different kinds of ocean currents. There are currents that move along the surface of the sea or of a lake or of the ocean, and then there are currents that come from deep under the waters. The ones that are on the surface they might be riptides. They might be just longshore currents or something like that. And I think of those as being comparable to technological developments, like new programs, new technologies, including AI. These things rip into our lives and they carry us along, sometimes helplessly. We also have this emotional experience of this, and those are the upwelling currents that come from the deeps of human life. And so at the intersection of those surface currents and those upwelling currents of profound emotional either excitement or exhaustion or enthusiasm or curiosity or fatigue or fear, all of these powerful emotions, they meet that technological development, and it's just digital overwhelm. So that's how I picture what's going on when people feel digitally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes sense. I believe it will make more sense when we dive deeper into the topic.
Of course.
One of the irony of things is that we'll talk about digital overwhelm, and I know that later on you talk about some measures to reduce digital overwhelm. But I feel that as content creators, as people who their business and their work is basically doing stuff digitally, right? Like how if it was someone who maybe who was like doing maybe a construction worker, they are probably going to say, okay, I'm just going to quit social media, quit all this platform. But like basically,
that's right.
Social media is my job. That's what I do. That's how I make my money.
Yeah.
So how do I go about dealing with digital overwhelm?
I love this question. I think it's at the heart of my book. So one of the wisdoms that I've encountered in reading about digital technology is that when there is too much of it going on in your life, you can do what you described. You can cut it out of your life. You can get rid of social media. But there are many people, like you've just named, who can't get rid of the digital. It's integral to their work. And I interviewed dozens of working professionals, Gen Z and millennial professionals. And many of them don't really have a choice. Like they're just embedded in the digital world. And so some of the wisdom that's out there, which I very much honestly wisdom, is digital minimalism. And my book doesn't recommend digital minimalism. I don't recommend minimizing the technology. Instead, I recommend digital flexibility. And in the book, I call this switching your mode, getting good at using multiple modes of digital engagement. So that's my answer to you, wisdom, is no, I don't tell you to get off digital media. And instead of that sort of digital minimalism, I recommend a digital flexibility.
Yeah, I noticed that digital overwhelm is one of, how do I explain this now? It's one of an area of research for you.
Yes.
So I noticed that you're a professor of faith and communication. So of all the things like you could focus on, why that?
I think a researcher is sometimes directed by the data. I don't mean that the researcher is passive. There's an element of making sense of the data. But when I talked to all these dozens of rising professionals and asked them what it was like to cope with the pressures of life in the early 2020s, I sat back afterwards and said, what's the story that this data is telling me? And that's where I came up with this idea of digital overwhelm. I knew it was some kind of overwhelm. They all agreed that they felt overwhelmed, but I think there were different ways to describe that. But given the presence of technology in everybody's work, probably given the fact that so many people were working remotely at the time and are still working remotely, I think that digital description just made a lot of sense. And then on top of that, there was the supernova of artificial intelligence, large language networks. ChatGPT came out in a big way just as I was approaching the end of my writing and research. So all of that put together, it made sense to describe it as digital overwhelm.
Yeah. For me, the question I want to ask is, how do I know that I'm suffering from this thing? You just call it digital overwhelm.
That's a good question. It's not like a diagnosable condition, at least not one that I can diagnose. I'm not a clinician or something.
Yeah.
So the best way that I guess on the one hand, I depend on people to recognize it for themselves. Just like that feeling that you get when you've been on a screen too much, or when you have too many applications open and you're just toggling from one application to another and never really completing a task. And you do that for an hour at a time and you're like, what am I doing? Or you get on a piece of technology like your laptop or an iPad or something, and you can't remember 20 minutes later what the original task was you were trying to do. I think it's pretty recognizable for many people. The emotional experience of it is pretty different though. Like some people find it quite energizing and some people find it quite deflating. So in my book, I refer to digital as that's a little bit of a joke. It's a word I'm making up.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's underwhelming and sometimes it's overwhelming, but it's always whelming.
Yeah, like underwhelming. So what you're saying is that digital overwhelm isn't always a bad thing.
I don't think people experience it always as a bad thing. Again, to use the kind of water imagery that I started with, if you can imagine being at a beach and a really big wave comes in and sweeps you off your feet, often you laugh, like it's fun. But if you're a mile out into the ocean and there's a gigantic wave, that's not fun anymore. And so I think the experience varies with the context and sometimes with the personality. Like you're a person who's always on digital media, you probably have greater resilience and energy for it than someone who's it's incidental to the work that they do.
Yeah. Like I get it now. But what if using your metaphor, if we're in a situation where we've gone beyond the underwhelm, we're now at a point where digital overwhelm is drowning us and affecting our productivity, our state of mind, and other things. What would you recommend we do? Because you said you don't recommend people cutting digital media off, but you talk about digital minimalism. But that itself sounds like a good idea. But how would that play out in real life?
I could try to answer that. I mean, that's some of the hardest work that the book tries to do. My book is like a conversation that I have with the reader, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to respond to a lot of different sorts of contexts. And so I offer every other chapter is what I call a mode switch workshop. And it's a half chapter. It's not a full chapter, but it offers these kind of practical pieces of advice. For instance, in dealing with Zoom fatigue or how to write an email that sounds like you. But when I pull back from the whole book and say, what's the through line of advice and counsel that I give for people who can't get rid of digital media, they can't eliminate it from their lives, and they don't even want to. What does it mean to deal with digital overwhelm? I can say a few things. So first of all, I think it's good to be honest about your overwhelmed condition. It is just too much. It's huge. It's much bigger than we are. The techno development is massive. And so there's a kind of freedom that comes in simply acknowledging that fact and not pretending like you have it under control. Secondly, I think that besides naming it, it's a good idea to situate it in human relationships. There's a writer on artificial intelligence named Ethan Mollick, and he describes the ways that AI is like all around us now. It's almost ambient to us, like an environment. But he says, what's his phrase? He says, be the human in the loop. Be the human in the loop. And I think if we can situate our digital overwhelm and situate it in human relationships, I think we're going to do better. So what that looks like in your inbox is going to look different than what it looks like on your smartphone when you're texting somebody or when you're on a call or when you're doing a podcast on Riverside like I get to do right now with you. In every one of these situations, we can't control everything. Hardly. Not at all. But we can say, what's the human community that I'm involved with here? Who's the person on the other side of the screen? Who's the person receiving this text? And what kind of relationship does this technology make possible? So I think naming your overwhelm and then resituating it in human community, human relationships is probably the big idea of this book.
Yeah. I like the fact that you talk about being the human in the loop and having a way to communicate with people and not just being so much in the digital, right?
Yeah, I think it's tempting to become like a part of the machine ourselves, just to think of ourselves as like, sort of like when I have a whole bunch of emails to pound through. It's easy to be a little bit like I'm a lawnmower and I'm just spraying these emails out, but we got to stay human. That's fundamental to this whole thing. We got to stay human.
Yeah. When I went through some of the works, you've worked on communication, you've worked with buying and attention and so many things. And I think Digital Overwhelm is like your most recent work. Yeah.
Yes.
I do have some other questions regarding
the
other stuff. One of the core things that's happening now is people are asking what is the ethics we should define when it comes to communication and influence, especially when you're creating content using these AI tools out there. So the question I want to ask is what's the common misconception people have about influence and communication?
Influence and communication?
Yeah.
Oh, so many. I get to pick.
Yeah.
So many misconceptions.
Okay.
Let's think about just two kinds of communication, though, where influence and communication are happening. Let's start with a dialogue like you and I are having right now.
Yeah.
So a common misconception is that dialogue, one-on-one conversation, is an utterly reliable way to get to know somebody else, and that the knowledge you gain from dialogue it's almost comprehensive. But the actuality is that although we often feel some kind of connection when we're conversing with somebody or dialoguing with somebody, there are whole continents of their identity that we don't know anything about. And so one of the misconceptions is that dialogue gives us an almost spiritual access to the other person. I think that might happen in some really remarkable moments, but for much of our lives, our conversations are still very spotty attempts to get to know each other. So it really makes sense to stay humble, even in conversations where we think, I know exactly what they're thinking. You probably don't. So that's one misconception. And before I go on to the other one, I wonder what that makes you think of.
Yeah. In a way, it's a tool, but it's not how do I explain this now? It's not the full package. It's just a medium. It's not the one size fits all. It's more like we could use this, but this is not the whole deal.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's very provisional. It's experimental.
Yeah.
We can have a reasonable confidence that we're communicating.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes we exaggerate how well we know each other just because we're face to face and in a conversation.
Yeah.
So you want to hear the second? The second misconception. Let's take a model of communication like a broadcast model. The disseminative model, it's sometimes called. The word is dissemination, and it's a word that means to scatter. As soon as we finish this podcast and you edit it and produce it and do all the magic that you do with your podcasts, you're going to put it on some platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts or LinkedIn or something. And then you're hoping it will scatter in a bunch of directions and a lot of people will listen to it. That's my hope too.
Yeah.
Sometimes people have a misconception that this is an essentially unethical form of communication because it's one way. We just broadcast it out there and it's like a shotgun or something. And it's that sort of unilateral communication doesn't allow for response. So some people think of it as like a lesser form of communication. And I think that's a misconception. First of all, it's a misconception because we really can figure something out about our audiences. Marketers and strategic communicators often are able to analyze their audiences to a remarkable degree. But secondly, I think there are situations where the most ethical thing to do is to have a one-way communication. I'll give you a quick example of this. But I think that there are some situations where a person who has a lot of power needs to sit down and shut up and let someone who doesn't have much power speak their minds. That's not going to be a dialogue. It's not going to be a conversation. It's going to be a unilateral form of communication. But it could be really morally important and ethically significant for that broadcast to happen. So that's another I think, misconception that sometimes shows up, that unilateral communication is essentially unfair and unethical. I don't think so.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that it depends on the purpose.
I think so. Yeah. And the
but
context.
one would also argue that in a situation where we need to engage in a dialogue and then we put a unilateral means of communication, then there will be a problem.
Say more.
Yeah, and vice versa. So I think there's a thoughtful influence, right?
What kind of influence are you talking about?
Thoughtful influence.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not just having thoughts behind the influence where you get to
Yes. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah,
sure.
So I think that decides the means of communication that we get to use. Yeah.
Yeah. I do think it's possible to have a thoughtful and ethical kind of influence. I'm teaching a class right now in basic public speaking at the university where I teach, which is Calvin University in Michigan. And one of the questions that we have to deal with, it might sound elementary to you, Wisdom, but it can be a hard question for people. Is it ever ethical to change somebody's mind? And I think it is. But yeah, your word is thoughtful. And I think that sort of intentional and careful and reflective influence is a possibility. And it is an ideal to strive for. Yeah, I hope your podcast helps people to do that.
Yeah, I know when it comes to matters like that, at the end of the day, the first question we get to ask when such a question is posed is, what exactly does it mean to change someone's mind?
Yeah.
And what kind of change are we talking about? Are we talking about brainwashing people, manipulating them to do something? Or are we talking about having someone walk through a thought process and get to make their own conclusion?
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's a good distinction. I think you're right.
Yeah, so that way we want to make sure we are saying the same thing, because in a situation where there are certain countries in the world right now where they don't have access to any form of media. So whatever anyone tells them is the rule and is the law, because they don't have an otherwise.
I see.
So in such a situation, one is not exactly, how do I explain that? It's not exactly ethical, because now the person doesn't have options to choose from. So whatever they believe is what they were made believe, not because, they question their belief and say, okay, yeah, this is it or this is not. It's just what they made to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. That's a very unfortunate situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you have to, as I'm just interviewing now, I'm just like thinking of future episodes I could probably invite you on to discuss. There's a good thing you mentioned public speaking and all that, and you talk about changing people's mind. I just want to take you up on that while still on the subject of communication, and is what does it mean to, in concrete terms, what would you define communication to be? Because most people say, oh, it's passing message across, but what would you say it means?
Yeah, that's a question I might want to have a whiteboard to do a little bit of sketching on and think about it. The definition you hinted at was the sending of a message from a sender to a receiver using some channel and producing some sort of effect. I think that's a pretty decent definition of communication. But it really skips over the whole phenomenon of meaning, right? And I think it also in some ways underemphasizes the importance of relationships. I think it's the use of language to construct and to share meaning in human relationships.
Okay. So the next question I want to ask is, how does public speaking fit into that definition?
When a speaker that's a good question, Wisdom. I appreciate you pushing me on that. When a speaker goes to the front of a room or to the front of a crowd and begins to address the crowd, the speaker uses language, so that part's easy, right? And usually the speaker has some initiative, so the speaker is going to put the language together in such a way that maybe they tell a story or they convey some statistics or some striking information or something. So they construct meaning and they share it with their audience. But they're not doing all the work. The audience also has to help to put that meaning together. If the audience doesn't get it, it's like trying to tell a joke and the other person doesn't get it. It's not a joke. It didn't work. And in a similar way, in a speech communication, if the audience doesn't help to put that meaning together and share it amongst themselves and back to the speaker, then the communication falls down. So all this is, of course, complicated by the digital, again, to return to that. But we're constantly doing this. I think this is what humans do. We use language, we use symbols to put together meaning and to share it. And digital tools sometimes they help us do that. Sometimes they obstruct us in that.
Yeah, it's a good thing you mentioned the audience, because the question I want to ask now is how exactly do we measure? Because now the thing is we're trying to send a message, and what determines if we've successfully communicated is if the audience gets the message we intended to send, not just any form of message, right? So how do we measure? How do we get to know that okay, what we had in mind is what they received?
I think that there are various ways to figure this out. None of them are very clean. Like, you can use surveys. You can watch what the audience does with the communication. You can look to see if there are any measurable effects from the communication. For instance, do they vote for your candidate? Or do they buy your product? Or do they subscribe to your newsletter? Whatever you're trying to get them to do. I have this experience pretty regularly. If I speak to an audience, I really enjoy the preparation for the speech. And I really enjoy the delivery. This week, I'm going to Chicago to give a speech at a college there. And I love that part. The preparation and the delivery are so much fun, but it's the after part. It's when I sit down that I really feel nauseated by it. And so the only way I can make myself feel better is to go and ask people, what did you hear?
Yeah. What did you, and what does that mean to you? Yeah, that's true. Because the reason why I'm asking this question is most people, they create content, and which is a form of communication. You're trying to communicate something out there to someone, and sometimes it's hard to really know if you're even making sense at all.
Yes.
Yeah. And you talked about asking them directly to get to know them. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when you can't do that, I write a weekly newsletter, and I often wish I knew more about what my audience was thinking. I think I don't really know how to solve this problem, Wisdom, so maybe you can help me solve it. But so often we do have to put messages out there, and we have some information, like maybe people like it, or maybe they share it, or maybe they subscribe to it. But yeah, I think some kind of qualitative data is really important. Some kind of focus group or conversation.
Yeah, I think if you do have an audience, I think the basic way is just ask them. Most of the time, if they're reading your newsletter, they're already getting value, they respect you, they get value. That's why they've not unsubscribed. So if you could just ask them 10, 15 minutes, and then they hop on the call, and basically you just ask them the question and you just listen.
Yes, that's so important.
And some questions that will get them to actually give you answers, not a yes or no questions. Looking at Digital Overwhelm, I actually thought that it was a book about maybe productivity, and of course the title sounds like it, but looking at it closely, I realized that it's actually a book about communication.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it is, that's very discerning of you. I think it's a book about communication because that is how we most often try to cope with digital overwhelm. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Like I said, we want to take this profound emotional experience we have of fatigue or exhaustion, and we want to move it into human relationship. And so we talk to people. We send an email. We shoot a text out. But we pull this overwhelming emotion, this affective experience, and we pull it into human community. And we usually use communication to do that.
One of the I think, how would I put it now? Would I say the fruits of communication? It often leads to building trust. Yeah. And for me, I'm like, okay, we could speak, we could do public speaking, but how exactly if someone wishes to say, okay, I want to communicate, but my communication is not just to pass a message, it's more about to build trust over time. So how would they go about doing that?
If they are asking that question, they are already on the right track. Like, they have a good goal to build trust, not just to broadcast some kind of idea, but to build an authentic relationship that's reciprocal and equitable and that honors the other. I think that's so important. So you've got a good goal already, and that feels to me like most of the work. And the rest of the work of building trust, honestly, Wisdom, it's not very complicated. It's the kind of stuff we learn when we're little kids. It's like learning how to speak as clearly as how, not deceiving the other person, and then learning how to listen as carefully as you can. Both those things are really simple practices. I wish it were more sophisticated than that, but those are the practices that build trust.
Yeah. In the blog of you talked about how you take some principles from the Bible literature. Yeah. And when we talk about ethics, with the foundation and the basics of ethics, most of it is from the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, I looked at a certain part of the Bible when I was working on this book, and it's called the wisdom literature. And that includes the books of Job and the books of Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and so forth. And those books are great because they don't give you easy answers. They don't give you, sometimes they give you things that look like easy answers, but very often they are trying to pull you into deeper thought and to make you ask questions and to practice prayerful discernment. So for me, those were really important voices to have there. I think there are a lot of wise people today, and I buy a lot of books and I read a lot of books, but always I need to have the voices of Job and the psalmists and Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs and the teacher in Ecclesiastes. I need those voices in my life. They give me grounding, and they, in a way, to return to some of the imagery we were talking about earlier, they help me see the horizon. Very often in everyday life, I can't see the horizon. But these books open things up, and I can see something longer and wider.
The reason I bring up those references is because as someone creating content online, one of the biggest fear, one of the mistakes a lot of people make is that, I'll use this word, they sell out, right? They leave their values and what is actually true to their core and in chasing fame and money and other stuff. So for me, I want to ask, how do we balance trying to persuade people, trying to be authentic? How do we balance it such that we don't end up going beyond the line? Crossing the line, the imaginary line. Yeah.
I feel that temptation myself. Like I said, I'm in this world too. I write a weekly newsletter. I do a podcast. I'm talking to you on your podcast. And I hope that a lot of people will listen. Yeah. So I understand that temptation to just get more and more eyeballs on my content, get more and more attention to my content. And it's very easy when those are your goals to sell out, like you said.
Yeah.
So I get that. I feel that temptation, and I have to fight it. And that, for me, is another reason that the wisdom lit of the scriptures is so important. Because when you hang around Job, you realize that human life is full of suffering. And when you hang around the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes, the philosopher, you remember that life is also full of apparent contradictions and absurdities and things you can't control. And that's the stuff that we try to forget about when we're seeking fame and celebrity. We're trying to control everything.
Yeah.
And we're trying to act like suffering is not a part of my life. We try to pretend like we're not going to die someday. We try to forget all that stuff. And the wisdom lit, it just doesn't let you forget it. It just keeps those realities in front of your eyes at all times.
Yeah, I believe in the saying that we need to be reminded more often than we need to be taught. Most of the things we know them, but we just need a constant reminder in this noisy world.
There's a character at the beginning of the book of Proverbs that I referenced a little earlier. She's a character called Lady Wisdom.
Yeah.
She stands in the busy intersections, the busy streets, and she says, "How long will you simple ones love your simple ways?" I often think about that phrase. How long are you going to love doing the stupid things you do when I'm offering you wisdom? It really is a matter of listening to the deeper voices. And I think in some ways the older voices of the scriptures are just the best guides.
Yeah, like Proverbs, in a way, it's unlike other verses, right? That is as if it's written to someone. Proverbs is like written to you, it's talking to you directly. Like, it breaks the fourth wall, and you're like, it becomes personal business. If you are reading Kings, now you're like, okay, so David did this, okay. So this is what happened to David, okay. With Proverbs, it's like, my son, listen to me. Like that's one of the things I just like Proverbs, and especially the psalmist David, "Oh, bless the Lord, oh my soul, please do not forsake me." When you are reading it, it's just like you are crying out. Honestly, there's a lot to be learned from the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes too.
Yes, I believe so. Thank you for naming those. That was a very important part of my book. Not everybody wants to talk about that.
Yeah.
And I get that. I understand. Like, people have a very different experiences of organized faith, and sometimes it's pretty difficult experience. They've experienced abuse or authoritarian structures or something. But for me, those voices they're like compasses. They help me know which way is north and how to sail that way.
Yeah, like when you say this now, I just remember, I think the story of the 5 blind men. I don't know if you've heard of the story before.
I remember that story, I believe.
Yeah, and I think they went out, they were like, the head of the elephants, they were like, oh, this is an animal that we've heard about. We should go feel it one day. So somebody took them to an elephant. One touched the tail, one touched the trunk, one touched the body, one touched I think 5 different parts of the body. And so each of them, they all had their description of what an elephant was. In a way, you could say, if the one who touched the tail said, the tail is a rope, the elephant is a rope. So how do you argue with that, man? Where will you start from? Actually, it's not... So for me, I'm just like, it's their perspective and it's their experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think the wisdom literature is really great about reminding us of that our conceptions of things, our frameworks for things are limited.
Yeah. I see that the book was released last 2024.
You're correct. Yes.
Yeah. I know we've talked about what the book entails, and but I'd love for you to just give us a glimpse of what it was like writing the book and gathering the research and more. Okay, let's just start from where the inspiration came from, and then
It started with conversations. I began by talking to people who were graduated from the college where I was teaching and were now 5-10 years into their work. And I just talked to them and I asked them to tell me stories about what it was like to be doing the work they were doing. And then I would get transcripts of these interviews, and then I would think about those interviews and write down themes and try to look for patterns. And like I said earlier in our conversation, what's the story this data is telling me? And I decided eventually this story is a story of digital overwhelm. And so then I had to figure out how to organize the story and how to tell it. And basically the way I decided to tell it was, how are people coping with this digital overwhelm? And so each of the chapters shares a different way of coping with that overwhelm and the strengths and the weaknesses of each of those coping mechanisms. As you pointed out, they're all communication modes. That's how we cope. And when I had that framework, then I just had to write and I had to read. And often I would be trying to contrast what I was writing with what somebody else had already written, either saying there's overlap or saying, that was great, but I want to take this in a different direction because I'm talking about the workplace or something like that.
Yeah. So like, how long would you say it took you overall to write the book?
I started the interviews in December of 2021, and then I finished writing in, I think it was March of 2023, somewhere in there. And then you submit it to the publisher, and then they send back you have to proofread it and copy edit it and all that stuff. So that took a long time, but I really enjoy the process of writing, and I like making something. When you're working on a book, you're making a thing, and it slowly takes shape. There's a lot of rough periods, especially at the beginning, where it doesn't seem like it's a thing, and you're like, I don't know if this is ever going to exist.
Yeah. I like the fact when you talked about making certain decisions, like you have to say, okay, now this is not going to the book. We have to add this. We have to cut this out.
Yes, that's right. There's quite a lot of that. Quite a lot of cutting things out.
Yeah. In one of, I thought it was breaking. In one of I haven't read the book though, but in one of, you talked about communication strategies and all that. And as much as possible, I've tried to find ways to connect everything to content creators. And those are the people listening to the podcast. For me, earlier on I defined digital overwhelm, and I said, for me, overwhelm is a point where everything gets so much that I end up doing nothing. That for me is overwhelm. And then when you talk about digital overwhelm, I mean, I've had instances where I get overwhelmed by the forms of media screaming at me, and at the end of the day, I just stop. I end up doing nothing. And for me, I know that if I had some forms of filter to filter what comes in and goes out, it will in a way reduce the overwhelm. And I don't know if that's something you covered in your book, or I'd love to ask, what are some of the filters I could put in place that could just keep things under control?
I think what you described, that experience of, so many things screaming at you and you feel a little paralyzed, you feel stuck, you feel shut down. I think that's your body talking to you, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. Your body knows sometimes before your brain, not that your brain isn't a part of your body, but I mean, your physical frame sometimes knows stuff before you have a thought about it. And that impulse to shut down is a good one in a way. I don't think you can stay there, but I do think we need rest, and I do think we need contemplation, and we do need to, when I was a kid, I was bored a lot. I didn't have ready access to the kinds of entertainment that we do today, where I never have to be bored. That period of quiet and stillness and Yes, it might be fatigue and tiredness, but your soul needs that. Listen to your body when you shut down. It's okay. It's time. I gotta quit.
Yeah, but for me, it's more okay. How do I prevent such things from happening more often?
Yeah. I don't know if I have any striking new insights on that one. I think you learn, right? I bet you've already learned quite a lot about how long you can work and how much media you can intake. And everybody has a different amount. And so you have to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
It's figuring out how much coffee you should drink in a given day. You drink too much and you're going to get a headache, and you drink too little and you're not going to have sufficient energy. So you experiment and you figure it out. So that's not a very interesting answer, but honestly, I think it is a lot of experimentation.
So what you're saying is we should basically look at the things and study and ask ourselves, why is this stuff coming up? And then become our own little scientists.
That's right. I love that. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Like, I've learned so much from this conversation, and probably in the future, I'm thinking a situation where I don't know, because when I hear communication, public speaking, I feel like they're like siblings, like the same,
right,
from the same cloth. And I'm thinking in the future, maybe I would have to reach out to you for an episode on public speaking where we'll talk about like the tactics and techniques. I don't know if that's something that...
I would love that. I'd love that.
Yeah, I knew I learned a lot from this chat. The question I want to ask is, if someone wants to like read about your book, learn more about you, check what you're doing, where can they connect?
I would encourage them to check out my website. There's a website just called themodeswitch.com. That's TheModeswitch, The Mode Switch. You can find my book, Digital Overwhelm, basically wherever books are sold, but maybe the easiest place would be Amazon. But if you have some kind of online bookseller, that might be a more responsible choice. So yeah, it's not hard to find the book. It's Digital Overwhelm, and yeah, just look for Craig Mattson.
That's a wrap on today's conversation with Craig Mattson. If this episode gave you something to think about or just helped you feel a little more human in the middle of all this digital noise, consider supporting the show. You can keep these conversations going by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/wisdomhq. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.